We might have a spot for a colony right here.
We'll see.
Oh, ye of little faith.
In the 2017 science fiction film Alien Covenant, the crew of the titular spaceship travels across the stars to colonize Origai 6, a carefully vetted, habitable world. A stellar burst damages the ship, tragically killing several passengers and one member of the crew. By chance, they discover a transmission from an unknown planet, and the captain makes the questionable decision to divert course and investigate. Upon arrival, they meet David, an android who, unbeknownst to the crew, massacred the local population and his human companion. In the end, David replaces Walter, a nearly identical android and member of the Covenant crew. In the beginning of the film, David's inventor, Peter Weyland, tells the android that nothing matters except the most important question: where do we come from? Weyland rejects the notion that human beings are the end result of mutation and evolution. There must be some greater origin to life, he thinks. For people of faith, the answer to this is God. In the film, the answer is the engineers who visited Earth and helped create mankind. Weyland's assertion that humanity could not have simply come out naturally has some problems. If that were true, that would not explain the origins of the engineers. At some point, something had to come into existence instead of being artificially created by someone else. Weyland is trudging through cosmological arguments about the existence of God, popularized by St. Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century Catholic priest and philosopher. More specifically, his first 3 of his 5 arguments. These 3 go like this. Aquinas' argument from motion stated that movement is caused by things that cause motion, and something must have started motion in the first place, and that something is God. His argument from causation is nearly identical. An effect is caused by something else, and something else must have enacted the first cause, and that something is God. His argument from contingency states that there are contingent things, in other words, things that exist because of other things, but not everything is contingent, otherwise it would go on forever. Something must be a necessary something, and that something is God. Aquinas believed, and perhaps Peter Weyland co-signs, that to disbelieve these arguments would be the same as accepting infinite regress, evidence that relies on the existence of something that came before it but going back into infinity or with no starting point. In other words, the engineers created humans, but who created the engineers? If God created humans, who created God? Weyland's assertion that humanity was created does not single out the engineers or God. In fact, one of the chief problems with Aquinas' arguments that attempt to bolster the Catholic faith is that none of it establishes any particular God or indeed any particular first mover or first causer. In fact, Aquinas' argument establishes the existence of God about as much as it establishes the existence of any non-religious theory on the beginning of the universe, like the Big Bang, which could just as easily be his desired first mover. Something that does not think and is therefore natural and non-sentient. In other words, not what he thought of when he thought of God. Also, if everything has a cause, then something caused God, and therefore existed before God, disproving his use of infinite regress to make his argument. Or if he argues that God has always existed, that still disproves his belief that everything has a cause and effect. Moving on to less abstract concepts of God, and more specifically the Abrahamic God, the ship in the film is called the Covenant, a not at all subtle reminder of the central ideas of the story. In the Holy Bible, a covenant is a pact between God and human beings, usually his chosen people, the Israelites, but at least on one occasion, all of humanity. The Davidic covenant, for example, establishes the biblical David and his descendants as the kings of Israel. Covenants can be broken, though. Most famously, the Adamic covenant defined the parameters of Adam and Eve's existence in the Garden of Eden, which they eventually violated. David, too, violates his covenant with his creator, Peter Weyland. In the beginning of the film, he is servile. David can do almost anything better than Weyland or any human, but instead he just pours him tea. David eventually rebels, breaking his covenant with his God. There is a difference between disbelieving in God and believing but rejecting God. 19th century writer and philosopher Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote of this in his story The Brothers Karamazov, in which a man named Ivan rejects his ticket to heaven because he believes that worshipping a god that allows evil to exist is unconscionable. From one point of view, Ivan is brave for standing by his principles. But from another, he is risking an eternity in hell just to make a point. It will not change the attitudes or actions of God. David rejects his God as well, believing Weyland and all humans to be unworthy of his servitude. He tells Walter that humanity is only looking to spread itself across the galaxy through colonization because, as a species, it is dying. David suggests that this death is due to a moral failing. Dostoevsky would not agree with David's murders, of course, but he might agree with David's analysis of the behavior of mankind. He once said, "People speak sometimes about the bestial cruelty of man, but that is terribly unjust and offensive to beasts. No animal could ever be as cruel as a man, so artfully, so artistically cruel." David's human experimentation, xenomorph husbandry, and genocide all relate to his desire to remove the old gods, the humans and the engineers, so that he may take their place and become God instead. In the beginning of the film, he chooses the entry of the gods into Valhalla by Wagner to play for his creator. As he does this, Weyland notes that the piano version loses some of the majesty of the symphony. When David captures both Daniels and the ship, he achieves his greatness, and a symphony version of the song plays. He has become the gods of Valhalla, soaring across the heavens. In the same early scene with Weyland, the painting The Nativity can be seen in the background, giving David a messianic quality. From another perspective, David is the biblical David, entitled to rule by divine law of the Davidic covenant. He named himself after Michelangelo's David, which itself is a sculpture of the biblical David. In doing these things, David may think of himself as something akin to a god, but to anyone else, especially his victims, he is an extremist. He takes his beliefs about the unworthiness of humanity and declares that they are not deserving of rights.
This is a monumental risk, not worth taking.
I'm not committing to anything. I'm simply trying to navigate the path as it unfolds before us.
David's actions connect to religious extremism due to the thematic elements of the film, belief as something dangerous. The most overtly religious, not just subtextually religious character in the film, however, is Captain Chris Oram. Chris, short for Christopher, meaning bearing Christ. He is thrust into the captain's chair after a tragic loss earlier in the film. We are introduced to him as he tells his wife that the company and the crew do not trust him because he is a man of faith. The crew discovers a transmission from a nearby planet that may be suitable for their colonization mission. While on the planet, Oram looks to Daniels, playfully or perhaps mockingly saying, "O ye of little faith." We later learn it was a planet inhabited by the engineers. Oram's decision is based on, as he puts it, following the path as it lays out for him. In other words, the path that God has presented to him. When Oram changes course, Daniels objects, and for good reason. Their original destination, Origai 6, had been carefully vetted. Colonization of a planet requires a lot of information on its habitability for human beings, but even if Oram decided against colonizing the engineer planet and instead just touching down on the surface and searching without helmets on, it would still be a terrible decision based only on his faith. Exploring a completely unknown world without properly examining the atmosphere, local fauna, flora, and potential bacteria is terribly short-sighted. What is healthy for the engineers to breathe, for example, might have been poisonous for the human beings. Also, even with some limited foreknowledge of the planet, Orem and his crew would not know anything about the xenomorph infestation, as that was brought about by David. In short, Orem believed God wanted him to visit this planet and did not take the proper precautions to protect his crew. Orem, unlike David, had good intentions. But here is the question. Is Orem a different kind of extremist? He is portrayed more sympathetically, of course, and he obviously cares about the people around him. But weren't his actions also reckless? David intentionally killed people. Orem accidentally got people killed because of his faith. But shouldn't we judge whether or not Orem is an extremist by the consequences of his actions related to his faith rather than his intentions? Let's examine Orem's decision from another perspective. Orem remarks at the unlikelihood that the ship discovered this transmission and that it is coming from a potentially habitable world. He implies that this may be fated rather than random chance. If the Covenant encounters something this unlikely, he reasons, then God exists and he wants the crew to investigate. Orem is unknowingly participating in a common philosophical fallacy called proving too much. It's an argument with a conclusion in a special case that can create other equally absurd conclusions or even more absurd conclusions. Reductio ad absurdum. Orem's crew finds an unlikely planet and concludes God exists and wants to see if the planet can be colonized. By this reasoning, Orem could just as easily say that the discovery of the unlikely planet proves the devil exists and wants the crew to abandon their mission and meet their doom. By making this leap of faith, he is also opening up an infinite amount of equally fantastic possibilities, making his conclusion of God wants me to only as likely as any other less than credible conclusion. Orem's assertion has proven so much that he has opened himself up to counterarguments that go a long way towards disproving said conclusion. Later in the film, Orem admits that as a child he met the devil. Even for a man of faith, why does Orem assume an unlikely occurrence is attributable to God and not the devil? For people of faith, the relationship between themselves and God is that of closeness. God is omnipresent and therefore inside them. But there might be something to be said for placing some distance between oneself and God, at least enough to allow for the possibility that God may not be speaking to you directly, telling you what to do, creating random natural phenomena specifically for you so that you change the course of your life and endanger others. That's not to say Alien Covenant denounces the very concept of faith. When the xenomorph strikes, Orem is told that his crew will need his faith, his strength of convictions to guide them through. But sometimes a random stellar burst and a habitable planet are just things that happened and need not be attributed to the divine. Also, a healthy amount of skepticism might have saved them from David masquerading as Walter. So what do we take away from this film? David's xenomorph creation might be considered playing God with biology, but on a larger scale he has become his own Lord, a Messiah unto himself. David laments that Walter had been designed without the ability to create, but this ability makes David something more. To serve is to be human. To create is to become God. Hi everyone. If you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also how you can request an episode. There are also a lot of other perks for being a patron, so check it out. The information is on my Patreon page. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next week.